Welcome, everybody. We will be starting in just a minute or two. Going to be admitting a few more folks here. Well, welcome everybody. Good Monday morning and welcome to the 2021 residency workshop. I will be kind of doing triple duty here. So I'm going to be admitting people and trying to handle all the notes that come in here. So give me a second. So you should all hope you're all in the right place. We are at the residency workshop for 2021, and I'm just going to go ahead and get started. So let me start by introducing myself. I'm Gail Wooten. I know quite a few of you. I work at the Washington Student Achievement Council, and I am your residency person here at the state. And I want to especially point out the residency website that has been updated very recently. And I really hope that that's going to be a place after this webinar that helps answer a lot of your questions. It's written to be for both practitioners, students, families. So please take a look at that if you haven't already. And just a little bit of housekeeping. This is being recorded, and I will be checking the chat. So I've got the chat open, so please chat questions in. There will be plenty of time for questions throughout. We've got this set up, so this is a 10 to 12 session this morning, and I do understand that you might have to come and go, and that's totally fine. So 10 to 12 this morning, and then we'll take a 2-hour break, and then we'll come back at 2. And like I said, you can chat. This is being recorded, and hopefully this will be a good way to spend your Monday morning and afternoon. And let's go ahead and move on to our next slide. Like I said, I'm still admitting people, so we won't be getting into the meaty stuff for another couple slides here as I admit folks. So who is WASAK? So a lot of you know who we are, but we're a state agency in Olympia, and our main goal is increasing educational opportunities for Washingtonians. And my role here is, I have a lot of different hats that I wear, but today my role is around residency. And as a lot of you know, and I hope you all know, residency is a big part of what makes college affordable here in Washington, and our agency helps communicate the laws around who gets in-state tuition and who meets residency requirements for state aid. Our agency also administers all of our state financial aid programs, like the Washington College Grant, and we also administer the WASFA application. And so we are going to have a session in about an hour to hear more about how the WASFA intersects with residency and how financial aid throughout. I'll be sprinkling in how financial aid connects with residency. So that's a little different than how we've done this in the past. In the past, this session or this workshop has been primarily for residency officers at the public institutions. This year, we invited our private financial aid officers who administer the state financial aid, and they also have to know residency law. And so a lot of what I'm going to be talking about today might come at you from like, we'll be talking a lot about tuition, but I'll also discuss how it connects to financial aid. So that's a good segue into our next slide, which is really our agenda for today. So the first half of our day is going to be talking about just residency in general. And just so you know, this training is specifically for folks who are making residency decisions. So it can get technical at times. If you are not a residency officer or you're not a financial aid officer who makes residency decisions, it's okay to be here. But just be sure that you have you've connected with that person who makes those residency decisions at your school, because one of the things that we hope you walk away with today is that really it's that person, that residency person at your school, who is the final decision maker. And if you aren't that person, please work with them to discuss how you want residency to be communicated at your school. In general, if you aren't that decision maker and you're working with students, you want to be really careful about what you tell students, because you don't want to tell them something that might be incorrect. And so, yeah, just work with your residency officer, but you're welcome to be here, and just know that this is going to be technical. As I mentioned, this is recorded. You probably got a note saying that. Please, if you have any questions, just throw them in the chat. You can also raise your hand. I think I'll be notified if that happens. So we'll give that a shot if that works for you. And again, this is just our first half. We'll be going until 2. We'll have a break. And the first half, we're going to be just talking about these first 2 things, just residency in general. And then we'll really dig into residency for undocumented students, including having some folks share with us what the experience is like for students. And then the second half is more about getting into residency for military families, talking a little bit more about our residency processes at our institutions. And then the last hour is going to be with our Assistant Attorney General, who works with us on residency law. And so if you don't have questions now, please, as you go through the day, think of those kind of difficult questions for our Assistant Attorney General. Like I said, I can answer questions throughout, but there may be some that I can't answer. And if that's the case, we'll set those aside for Justin Colseth, who's the Assistant Attorney General that we work with. So before we continue, I would like to do some intros, but not in the typical way. We're just going to have you answer a couple polls. So this first one is, I just want to know who is here, because as I mentioned, this is typically for residency officers at our public institutions. And this year we've added private institutions. And so I know obviously who signed up for this workshop, but I know not everyone's going to be able to attend. So I just want to see who's here and now. And it's looking like about half of you are residency officers from the publics, and then about a quarter are financial aid administrators. And we've got another good chunk of other. I think that might be a lot of WASAK folks. So I'll go ahead and end that poll. Thank you. That's going to help just make sure that we're getting the information out that you need based on your institution and your staff position. So I think I'm sharing that with you now. So the next poll is, let's see, hold on a second. Give me just a moment. I have another poll for you. Oh, here we go. So the next poll is, this is also a question. I asked a version of this question when you registered to see how much experience you have. So obviously I know of who registered, where we're at with experience, and it really ranges. We have brand new folks to experts. But again, I just want to see who's actually here right now. And it's looking like a big chunk of you are kind of in that, that I know a lot, I've been doing this for a while. I either know the basics and I've got a little ways to go, or I've been doing this for a while. So, but we do have some new folks, and that's helpful. I will be kind of, as you see, as we get going, we will be kind of talking very elementarily about residency here at first, because what I'm finding, and just so you know, I've been doing this work for a little over 5 years. What I'm finding is sometimes you got to go right back to the basics to really all be on the same page of really what we're talking about when we're talking about residency. So thank you, everybody, for participating in that. And I'm going to go ahead and get started. And I'm going to actually stop my video, and I'm just going to be a talking non-head. All right, let's go ahead and get started. So as I mentioned, we're going to start at the very beginning. Why does student residency matter? And it's because this is a key piece of how we can make college affordable in Washington, how the legislature has been able to make it affordable. And basically, if you meet residency requirements, you pay in-state tuition, hence our public residency officers here. And you basically meet residency requirements for our state aid programs. You have to meet other requirements, primarily financial requirements, but every single financial aid program that we offer also requires residency. So that's why we're saying that this is a key piece of affordability. And so for those of you who've been at a lot of these trainings, this attention to the affordability piece and this attention to financial aid is going to be it's not a new concept, but I'm talking about it more than I typically do because it's more than just talking about in-state tuition, especially because Washington College Grant has now been expanded to be offered to anyone who qualifies, whereas before there was a limit. We would run out of money, and if you had applied too late, too bad. So this is a really important concept, and we just want to make sure that that's kind of the basis of where we're at. So another basic slide is that what I'm going to be going over today is based on 2 areas of law. The Revised Code of Washington, or RCW, which you'll hear me talk about a lot, is really the basis of where our residency laws come from. This is when legislators write bills, and pass bills, this is the language that comes from those bills. It goes right into the RCW. And then we have the WAC, the Washington Administrative Code, and you might hear me talk about WACs too. And those are actually, those are called rules, and WASAK actually has the authority to write those WACs. And the purpose of those is to clarify and expand upon RCWs. You might but probably will see places where they conflict with each other. And if that's the case, it's more than likely because the WAC hasn't been updated along with the RCW. So you definitely, the RCW outweighs the WAC. Unless it's something related to how to define student independence and dependence, and but that's beyond the scope of this workshop. The main thing to take away from this is that these are the 2 areas where we have residency law, and when I'm answering your questions, it's because I'm actually looking at these, and you yourself as a residency officer and as a financial aid officer doing residency work should at least have looked at these and be somewhat comfortable with them. And so that's kind of the takeaway with that. As far as financial aid is concerned, these 2 pieces are specifically about, you can see it in the title, Washington resident for tuition purposes. These 2 laws are about who is a Washington student resident who can get in-state tuition and fees. Other laws, which I'm not going to be talking specifically about I'm not listing them here, but other laws about financial aid point back to that RCW, point back to the residency RCW to say, you qualify for XYZ financial aid program if you meet residency according to RCW, blah, 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 and you meet these other things. So that's, again, where financial aid intersects with this work. And I think the other thing, why do we even have laws? There's a lot of different reasons. I would say from a student perspective, one main reason is so that students are treated fairly in the residency determination process. Also, so that you all have clear rules to ensure you're in compliance with the law. It's also to ensure that tax dollars are supporting residents versus those who move here solely to attend college. And residents are, as we'll talk about, are a wide-ranging group. And our laws actually are written to ensure that both citizens and non-citizens can be Washington student residents. And we'll obviously get into that. So if there's any questions, again, please throw them in the chat. But again, these are just intro. We're not getting into the specifics yet. We're talking very broadly about residency in general. So before we get into the specifics, I do want to talk about the residency determination process. And because we have private and public schools, it's different at each of your institutions, but this process is essentially the public process. This process says that the residency officer basically determines if the student meets residency requirements for tuition purposes. They then make sure the financial aid office knows if the student is a resident and how they qualified for residency. And then the financial aid office, using those financial aid laws and policies, they then take that information and then also see, does the student meet other requirements of whatever financial aid programs? And of course, at the private institutions, you're doing all of this in one office. So private institutions have the advantage of not having to communicate among offices to make sure that residency is determined correctly. So a few things here about this slide that are key. One is, the school is actually the final say on residency decisions. We here at WASAK, although our role is to, again, write those WACs that I mentioned, that's one of our roles. Another role is to guide you on making residency decisions. We can always answer questions for you, but we also get calls from students who might have a complaint. And anytime a student calls us, the answer is always, depending on if it's public or private, you need to go back and talk to your school. Sometimes the answer may be, that's interesting. Let me talk to the school on your behalf, because sometimes there might have been a piece of information that wasn't shared with you or vice versa. So the main thing here is, again, you all by law are the final place where the decision is made, but we are here to help. The other piece I want to point out, and this is more for our public institutions, that is that the financial aid office should not be redetermining residency. You should be, obviously you all have to have you're all going to have your processes done differently, but one of the main things is you should be able to rely on your residency officer to make that residency decision. And that way you can do the rest of your job and look at what other things does the student meet, or requirements does the student meet, so you can determine if the student should get aid. However, if you see something that looks like a red flag, obviously you want to talk to your residency office and say, hey, I'm just curious, why is this student a resident? I see this, or this is looking weird to me, and you might actually catch something. So we really encourage you, if you don't already have a communications protocol between the two offices or some kind of very clear process, we really encourage you to do that, because what we don't want is for you to repeat work that should be done in your residency office. we know that financial aid offices, especially these last few years, have way too much work to do. And so please leave that residency work to your residency officer. And again, if sometimes we get calls from the financial aid office from the public institutions, and if it's a basic question, we'll answer it. But usually if it's residency related, we just say you need to talk to your residency officer. So if there's any questions there, please go ahead and raise hands, put them in the chat. We're going to go ahead and move on to, again, the basics, but again, we need to understand this information before we move on into the specifics. So we've talked about what residency is, like how it helps students, but who really is a Washington resident student? Well, we're at the point where we have almost 30 ways that a student can be a Washington resident student and pay resident tuition. So remember, this is all from that RCW, okay? So now let's add on to that the 6 financial aid programs that our office or that our agency manages. So each one of these has a law associated with it that points back to the residency RCW. And all 25/30 of those ways to be a Washington resident for tuition purposes also meet the residency requirements for these 4 financial aid programs. So these 4 very important programs, they have other requirements, but they're not where the majority of our financial aid comes from. The majority of our financial aid comes from the Washington College Grant and College Bound Scholarship. And those 2 programs only use 5 of the 25 ways. And so those are where we're going to be spending a lot of our time today. The rest of the 25 ways are really primarily for veterans, military, and their families. So we're going to talk more about that later this afternoon. But these 5 ways are really important to understand, especially for you financial aid folks, because it can be the meaning between lots of money and no money at all. And so let's go ahead and get into what those 5 ways are. So again, the 5 ways are based off of the residency statute, the RCW, Revised Code of Washington. And these are the 5 ways. And for those of you who have been doing residency work for a while, these are all very familiar, maybe not the unicorn, but we have the way that financially independent students can get residency, which we'll talk about. We have the way that financially dependent students get residency, which we'll talk about. C, I've put a unicorn there because it is a very old law that I don't think anyone would qualify for. It has to do with being continuously enrolled since like the early 80s. So you're probably not going to see that. D is also one that's not very common, so we're not going to really talk about it, but it's basically if you have a student who, it's really for students who maybe their families move out of the state right at the end of their senior year or something like that. As long as they enroll right away after high school, they get residency, even if they don't live here anymore. But again, we're not, C and D, we're just not going to talk about because you're not going to see it very often. And then E, this is new. And we're going to talk about that. This is our new residency law. By now, I hope you've either seen a webinar, read a memo, read an email, seen our website to know that what this new law is all about. But we're going to dig into it a lot more. But this law is essentially our tuition equity law. This is written in such a way that it's actually for all students who've lived here a year prior to entering college. And again, we'll talk more about that. It's called a tuition equity law because it's the only way that certain students, particularly undocumented students, can get access to in-state tuition and state aid. So, but before we're going to dig into these a little bit more, but before we do that, I actually have a pop quiz. We're going to see who's paying attention here. So our first quiz, this actually, I didn't talk about any of this yet. So we're going to see what you all think the answer is to. This is a true false question. A person must have a Washington domicile for a year to be a Washington resident student. Is that true? Do they have to have a year-long domicile? Or is it false? Okay. Oops. So I'm gonna share the results on that one. We're at about 40% true, 60% false. Does anyone want to raise their hand and write in the chat why they answered what they answered? Oh, Linda.
Not that I really am confident in my answer, but it's my understanding that they could physical residence here, but is different than domicile.
Yes, that's a very good way to say it.
Woohoo!
So, and let's see what other people wrote. So a dependent student may not live in Washington. Yeah, so we'll talk a little bit more about when you have a financially dependent student, their domicile, their residency is based on their parents' domicile, and they don't even have to step foot here. So that's one example. The new affidavit, and we're going to talk about that next. That's the new residency law, does not require domicile. So domicile is a very specific term that we'll get into. That it's kind of a like residency on speed, I guess. Allison lists, there's a few, if you're a National Guard, you're Native American, refugee asylee, you don't have to have a domicile here for a year. And actually, Lori, I like Lori's answer. The answer is it depends on several factors. That's a good answer. And that's actually an answer that I think you could do for every single part of residency. It depends. So the primary takeaway, the reason why I put that question that is presumably simple is because only a couple, and really only one, if we go back to our WCG CBS 5, the only one that actually requires a student to have a domicile, and a domicile is a legal definition, is A, financially independent students must have a year-long domicile here. And domicile is proven, is basically, that's showing that the student was physically present here and they intend to remain. And we'll get into that. But the rest of these may require, like this last one, it requires the student to live here for a year, but that's not the same as domicile. Living is essentially having your primary residence here. And you could have a primary residence here and not have a domicile here. So if that's as confusing as it sounds, yeah, you're right. It is as confusing as it sounds. But the main takeaway I wanted you to take from that is that domicile is not the be all and end all of residency. You can very much have a student who's never stepped foot in the state who is going to be a resident student for tuition purposes. And depending on how they met that residency law, they could also meet residency requirements for Washington College Grant or some other financial aid program. So let's talk about that new residency law. And the reason we're starting with this new residency law is because as I mentioned a few slides ago, this law is a tuition equity law, meaning that it's the only way certain students, particularly undocumented students, can qualify for residency. But it's also written in such a way that it's open to every student. And it's actually the most, from my opinion, and I would say most people would say that this is actually the most accessible path to eligibility, to residency eligibility. It's basically an easier way to be a resident for tuition purposes. It also incidentally is one of those 5 that I mentioned. So if you meet residency through these criteria, you also meet residency requirements for Washington College Grant and College Bound Scholarship. Of course, those students have to meet financial requirements, but that's why this is such a big deal. So this is the criteria. It's very simple, and we will talk in more depth about each of these 3 areas. But I'm just, at this point, this slide is just about the basics. So someone who has a high school diploma or equivalent that they've earned before they enter the college determining residency, someone who has maintained a primary residence here in the state, and someone who signs an affidavit saying they meet those requirements and will apply for U.S. permanent residency when eligible. Those folks are resident students for tuition purposes. They meet residency for Washington College Grant. This is a big deal because the previous version of this law, which was passed in 2003, made it a little more difficult. The student had to live here for 3 years before graduating from high school. The diploma had to be a high school diploma from Washington. This one doesn't require it to be from Washington. And so you can see where this is now more accessible for students, and and not just undocumented students, but all students. And because it has increased accessibility, this is the law that our recommendation is that you look at this option first when you're working with a student. So one thing I didn't mention back in the process for residency is each of your institutions has a different process in terms of that first round. So when a student applies to your school, and this is particularly for public institutions, as far as I understand, you may admit that student as a resident or non-resident based on what they've put on their admission app. And then in the privates, same thing with maybe their FAFSA, WASFA, or their admissions app. When a student gets admitted as a non-resident, or they get admitted as what we called it Evergreen disputed, I don't know if Evergreen still calls it that, that's when the student can come to the residency officer or the financial aid office at the private institutions and say, hey, I actually think I'm a resident, here's why. Or I want to find out how to be a resident. You as the residency officer or financial aid officer can say, well, do you meet these 3 or really these 2 requirements? If so, sign this affidavit. So, or if so, are you comfortable signing this affidavit? And FYI, that affidavit also has an option to say either that A, I'm a US citizen or permanent resident, or B, I will apply for permanent residency. And we'll talk, again, I'm going to talk more in detail about each of these items in a few slides, but I just want to get the basics out about here. So if you have more detailed questions about this law, I'm going to answer them in a few slides before we get into it, because I want to talk about the other ways, the other primary ways that students get residency. I'm talking about this first, though, again, because I want you as the residency officer to consider this option first when you're trying to figure out if a student is a resident. Before, you used to look at A and B, which we'll talk about, and those are actually can be harder to meet for students. And this option used to be kind of the way I thought about it. It was the backup option. If you don't meet A or B, by any chance, do you meet the residency affidavit? And now, because the requirements for the affidavit have switched to be easier, we're now saying, look at this first, and then if they don't meet this, then we'll start talking about the other ways that a student can get residency. So let's actually delve into that. And I do see questions. Let me just make sure, because I might hang on to those for later on. So let's go ahead. Some of these, so I'm going to hang on to those questions when we get to them in these next few slides. So main point of this slide is, if you have a student who wants to know how to be a resident, this is going to be your first, I guess, quote unquote, test for them, or first question for them. Do you meet this new residency law? So what about the student who doesn't meet this? You might have a student who comes to you who, I think a perfect example would be someone who has a parent who lives here, who has a domicile here, and the student themselves lives out of state. That person might actually be a resident, but they first have to have a qualifying citizenship or immigration status. So US citizens or nationals, people who are eligible to fill out the FAFSA, people who have DACA, current or expired, people who have an employment authorization document, that's a work permit, people with a U visa, and people who are PRUCAL or permanent residing under the color of law. And we're not going to list all of those, but that is in the handout, the basic residency overview that I sent out. These folks all have all 25 plus ways available to them. Note on here who's not on here. It's undocumented students who've never had DACA. Those students only have this law available to them. The other students who only have this law available to them are people who are pending asylum who don't have a work permit. So in general, you don't actually know what someone's, you shouldn't be asking, are you undocumented? But if someone comes to you and says to you, I'm undocumented, I've never had DACA, this is the only thing available to them. If they have had DACA or if they have a work permit, then they have all of the 25 ways I mentioned, including A and B, which we'll talk about. And this is where I'll start answering some of your questions. So if the student is a citizen or has a qualifying immigration status, which is a lot of people, the most common options available to them are going to be A, this is A from the RCW, they're independent, and FYI, the definition of independent is different than FAFSA, which we'll talk about, but they have to maintain a domicile in Washington for 1 year for purposes other than education, or if they're dependent, their parent or guardian must have maintained a domicile. And so let's see, I think we have some questions that are related to that. So student and spouse have rental lease past 2 years. However, student not giving up Colorado driver's license. So are they a non-resident? Actually, let's wait on that one because that's related to domicile. Okay, Sherry has a good question and it's related to this next slide. So independent A, dependent B, what is the definition of independence and dependence? It's here. So again, this is different than FAFSA, which is really irritating for those of you who are our financial aid experts on the call. But it's also simpler than FAFSA. So basically was the student claimed on taxes in their previous year or current calendar year, or did they receive student or significant financial assistance? So if the student was claimed on taxes, or if they received significant financial assistance, which is not defined, unfortunately, in the RCW or the WAC, if either of those are true, then the student is dependent and you have to look to their parents' domicile. If neither of them are true, then the student is independent and you look to the student's domicile. So this question that Sherry has about what if the parent doesn't live in Washington, student has lived in Washington for last year and has a lease, but the parents claim them on taxes. So in this case, the student was claimed on taxes. So they are dependent because you've said yes to either of these questions. Student is dependent, and that means that you have to look at the domicile of the parents. And if the parent's domicile is not in Washington, then the student is not a Washington resident. But remember, we have other ways. We have 25 plus ways to be a resident. So one question you could figure out is, do they meet the new residency law? This is a perfect example of someone who you'd want to figure out if they meet that new residency law. And in their case, it's, did they live here in the state before they started college? Did they live here for a year before they started college? So that would be one of the options available to them. I'll answer the affidavit one later, and this one I'll talk about later too. So a little bit more about independence, dependence. Obviously, I've said they're different from FAFSA, but they usually align. So for those of you who are in financial aid, it's typical that they're going to align. One of the things that is where it gets wonky is age and marriage don't matter. So you can have a married student whose parent is paying their expenses. So if we go back to here, that married student, if they're receiving significant financial assistance from their parents, they are dependent. So that's one of your wonky ones that you might run into. And I know that happens. And also just a note, burden of proof lies with the student. Basically, burden of proof lies with the student for everything here. Linda, I see a question from you, Martin.
Yeah, going back to the previous screen.
Sure.
So when you said, yes, so when you said this and then you said going to the, provided they are 1 year before starting, that's the current quarter, right? They could not have been attending your college before July 28th of this year. It's only effective this quarter. Is that how that application of that new affidavit?
Actually, it could have been, you could have a student who attended here lived here a year before, as long as they lived here a year before the first quarter they attended, the first quarter they started, they can start getting resident tuition this quarter. So
okay.
So if you had a student who lived here a year, let's say they started last fall,
Yes.
Non-resident tuition because they did not live here for a year and they could not meet residency through any other means. Or sorry. They did live here for a year, but they didn't have a qualifying immigration status to get it under one of these. Mm-hmm. So let's say this whole last year they've been paying non-resident tuition. If they come back to you this fall and they say, hey, I meet this new law, they do, as long as obviously they can sign the affidavit saying, I lived here a year before I started going to college. I had a high school diploma before I started going to college. It's just that you can't retroactively apply that resident tuition.
Oh, okay. I misinterpreted that because I thought it was effective prior to their first quarter attending with the effective date of the new law. So as of July 28th.
So the effective date meant that terms that landed around that July 28th, students could have gotten resident tuition as early as summer quarter or term this year, but they couldn't have gotten it any earlier than that.
Okay, that clears it a lot.
Yeah.
So it's just before their first quarter or the first time attending here, as long as they were a year. So like you just said, so the student graduated high school in 2019 and then came that fall and they've been here since. they can now have this affidavit opportunity, correct?
Exactly.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Awesome.
Yeah, thanks for that question. And I'll repeat that again in a few slides. So I see Edith has a question about, does that qualify them for state aid? I'm assuming you mean one of these. So yeah, so if a student meets one of these, A or B, they get resident tuition and they meet residency requirements for all state aid, including Washington College Grant and College Bound. So, and then of course, same with the new law. So basically, this is option one. They qualify for in-state tuition, they qualify for all aid programs. And this is option 2 and 3. But the thing about these two options is the student must have a qualifying citizenship or immigration status, which is going to be most of your students. And then this law is available for those who don't have a qualifying immigration status. And again, most of your students, a lot of your students are going to meet this too. So, so we've talked a little bit about independence, dependence, and now let's talk about the domicile piece. I made you do that pop quiz, and now we're going to talk a little bit more about domicile. So remember that if it's a student who's independent, if they don't meet the new residency law, they have to be independent or and have a domicile here for a year, or if they're dependent, their parent has to have a domicile here for a year. But what does that really mean? It's actually a two-step process. The student or the parent, depending on if they're independent or dependent, has to first establish a domicile. And that's where you're trying to figure out, did this person, were they physically present and did they intend to reside here? And that's where you all are probably very familiar with asking for a driver's license, for example. And then this goes back to you making the final decision as the school. You decide when was that last action taken? And that's the day that domicile was established. So once you've figured out, okay, September 20th, that was the day that their domicile was established. You then have to figure out, did the person maintain that domicile for a year prior to classes, for at least 1 year prior to classes starting? So, and one of the things that can be confusing here is that a student can leave, or the parent can leave the state during that time if it's a temporary, we call it a temporary sojourn. And as long as they don't establish a domicile elsewhere. So a few more things about, here's another look at what establishing a domicile looks like. So again, establishing a domicile is all about, does the person have physical presence here and do they intend to permanently reside? And that's where you're looking at driver's license, voter reg, lease, car registration, bank statements. I mean, you name it, it's up to you to figure out what is going to prove to you as the residency officer or the financial aid officer if the student has a domicile here. And then it's up to you to decide, when was that domicile established? And again, burden of proof lies with the student. If you see a student who appears to have a domicile in two places, they can't. So you have to figure out which one is the true domicile. And then almost anyone can establish a domicile. So that includes if you have a student who is financially dependent and you know that they're a qualifying immigration status or a citizen, they could have undocumented parents, and those parents can actually establish a Washington domicile. And again, you shouldn't be asking if the parents are undocumented, but this is more if the student shares that with you. The place where you're gonna run into issues with domicile is when you have, I've listed all these visas, but they mostly fall in the category of visitor or student visas. People on a visitor or student visa aren't able to establish a domicile here because of the laws around their visa to maintain their visa. So there was a domicile question that I can now answer. Let's let's see. So so this is from Linda Martin. Student and spouse have rental lease past 2 years. However, student is not giving up the Colorado driver's license. So this is a great example where the residency office, so I'm assuming in this case, the student is, you've figured out, Linda, that the student is financially independent. And so you're going to be looking at the student's domicile. And if that student doesn't meet the new residency law, the first question I would ask in this case is, does the student meet the new residency law? If they do, and if they feel comfortable signing the affidavit, that's what you want them to do. If they don't, then that's when you have to decide, you have to figure out if they've had a domicile here. There's no set, I'm going to skip, let's see, I'm going to skip this one. There's no set list of things that you have to ask for. It's based on each student's individual circumstances. This language is actually from the law, from the WASAK. So in the case of a person who has lived here for 2 years, they have a lease here. If they're not giving up their Colorado driver's license and that says to you that they still don't have a domicile, because really what that's saying, that might be saying to you that the student doesn't intend to permanently reside. They've been physically present here, but the question is whether or not they intend to remain is not being answered. So if there are other things they have that show they intend to permanently reside, that might help you decide. If the reason why they haven't given up the driver's license is because they can't afford it, that might be a good reason. So yeah, Linda, do you have more?
I've asked her for this. Yeah. And we did send her the affidavit and she has not signed it. And then she sent me a picture of like registering for an appointment with DMV from like last year. But it didn't have her name on it. The vehicle doesn't have her name on it. The lease is the only thing that has her and her husband's name on it. But my gut is just telling me she's not here. My gut is she's not.
So this is a great example of where I get to give the annoying answer of, the way the law is written is the way the law is written is the residency officer, it's up to the residency officer to determine if they have received enough evidence of sufficient quantity and quality to prove that the student has a domicile here.
Yeah, so, I don't generally use bank statements or voter reg because I still have my bank in both Arizona and California from 20 years ago.
Yeah.
And I still have my voter registration card, although it's current here in Washington, but I still have it from Arizona if I ever wanted to, and that's what I'm saying. I don't use those. I don't generally lean to those documents. Only because I know my own personal experience with my own moving and what I've been able to hold on to. So in establishing the residency, that's where I've been going to really the ID and the lease agreement, first and last page, the signature page, the date, time frames, trying to look at those things. But she's been very, I don't know if confrontational is the right word, but she's like, I've given you everything. I'm like, actually, you haven't. And I asked for an explanation of why she's keeping her Colorado driver's license, and she still hasn't done that either.
Let's open that up because I know for a fact that some of your colleagues have had similar situations where the student it's clear that they've been physically present. That part's easy. But the part where it's hard to figure out is, are they intending to remain? So Tina, do you have any suggestions or thoughts?
When someone doesn't have a current driver's license, one of the first things we always do is ask, well, why? But if the student declines to provide that information and we know that they are holding a current driver's license in another state, we would say you haven't established a domicile. If there's no good reason to do that, because they are presumably driving around and identifying themselves as a resident of another state. You know, if someone had taken other steps to establish domicile here, but they didn't have a driver's license, but when we asked them for an explanation, they have a really good explanation for it, like, you know, poverty, or hi, I've been in the hospital, or something like that. You know, that's one thing, but if they're not even willing to provide a reason, you know, that kind of says something to us. So yeah, you know, if you don't, we'd say no.
Yeah, thank you. I'm glad to, that was my feeling, because again, I've asked just for an explanation. Last year she said it was because of COVID. I know it took me, when I moved here from out of state, almost, 6 months to get my driver's license. So, okay, I get that, but that was, a year and a half ago. Now what? And she still hasn't done anything about it. So, as I shared, she hasn't explained why she's not going to get, outside of that, she has not said why she's holding on to Colorado.
So I appreciate, Linda, thanks for that, because that was a perfect example of where the challenges lie with domicile. And driver's license is one of those where, in general, if someone hasn't changed it over, that's a big indicator. But please remember that there's nowhere in law that says a driver's license, in residency law, that says a driver's license is required to be a student resident, because you might, again, have a student who can't afford it for whatever reason, but they've done everything else. Yeah, good point, comply. It's not required, but it shows intent. And that's true of any factor that you look at. So please keep that in mind. I do want to get into the new residency law, because I know that there's a lot of questions there. So we're going to pop ahead to that. But Randy, do you have?
Yeah, Gail, there is a law that says that if you're going to operate a motor vehicle on the roads of Washington State and you're here for longer than 30 days, you have to get your license changed over. So there is a law that says that you have to get your license changed over if you're going to be here longer than 30 days.
Right.
So
that's what I meant was none of the student residency laws say what documentation is required. But yes, there is another law that says you have to have it switched over. And so if you don't, it could be an indication of the student not intending to reside here. Yeah, Tina.
And her name's not on the vehicle, the vehicle registration. It's just the spouse's name. And that's why I wanted a little more information, but she's not disclosing. She's just getting more defensive. Trying to help her. Can you help me understand what other document? Because I don't feel comfortable with a bank statement or a voter registration. I just don't feel those are, like I said, I've still held mine out of state for over 20 years.
Well, I see Tanjagay shared if the student's receiving TANF or SNAP, that might be a reason. I actually think a voter reg is a good indicator, because if you have voter registration here, that's saying that you intend to participate in your community. But do others have documentation that they think is useful? And I agree that bank statements are not that helpful, especially in this day and age of online banking. That the law does point to bank statements as a possibility, but that law was written 30 or 40 years ago. Tina.
So some other stuff we look at is maybe disposition of property in the former state of residence, like if they were living in a house and then they sold that house and they no longer have it. I mean, it has to be a fairly substantial collection of things to overcome the failure to get the driver's license, particularly given that, the regulation that if you're going to be driving around here. But like if someone said, I don't drive, I use my passport as ID. I registered to vote here. I disposed of my only other place to live in the other place that I lived. And, and there were just kind of a slew of other things, it could be taken into account, but it's a tough one because it is a fairly easy thing to do for a lot of people, and yeah, again, people who are experiencing homelessness. I mean, there's reasons why someone could not have a driver's license. But I also want to say, if we're reaching out to somebody and we're asking them for more documentation and they're just like, nope, not going to give it to you, then, we try to help people, but they have to help us help them. And at a certain point, we stop going around with them and we're like, okay, well, then we're going to make a decision based on what we have. And that decision is no.
And Tina, I'm going to be the first person to say to you all that to be student first in your thinking. And I'm also going to say that our laws in several places say that it is the student's responsibility to get you the information for you to make the decision. So you want to find that balance of making sure that you've reduced the barriers for a student to get you the information, but also understanding that, yeah, the burden of proof is on the student. So it sounds like you're doing everything you can, and sometimes students just don't respond. And keep doing what you're doing, but know that it is, the law does, it says two things. It says you have to have the information, you have to be able to make the decision based on the information that you have, and it has to be of the right quantity and quality. And that doesn't mean that you make it hard for students to help themselves, but the law also says that the student has to, the burden is on them. So that was a great example and a great discussion of what happens with domicile. And I hope that helped some of you. And if there were other questions related to this, please hang on to them for the session with Justin at 3. I did see some of your other questions about EAD categories and H-4 visas. Very quickly, a student with an H-4 visa does fall in that qualifying immigration status. And the reason why I'm not going through all of them is because so many of our students are going to be meeting that new residency law that it's not as necessary anymore to understand all the different immigration types. And we also have a resource online for you all that I'll be sure to, actually, I can put the link in the chat. I can do that later. But you have the resources at hand to know that, and I'll be sure to follow up so you have that. But I want to get into the new law because I did skip over the details of it so we could talk about the two other ways of getting residency. But this new law is really important for you to understand. And I know that Gabi is on the line, who's going to be talking about the WASFA. And so, but before we get into that, Gabi, I do want to get more into this new law. So if you recall, the new law does require that the student have a high school diploma or equivalent, and the location is not specified in the law. So that means it can be earned outside of Washington and before moving here. If you have a student with a non-US diploma, it's considered, it has to be considered equivalent by your institution. And there are federal guidelines for non-US diplomas and diploma equivalents. Those federal guidelines are put forth for FAFSA purposes, for financial aid purposes. So if you're a financial aid officer on the call, this might be a familiar concept to you. If you aren't, I would recommend that you sit down with your admissions and financial aid office and figure out what is equivalent to a US diploma. And I would also say that in general, you aren't actually digging in to their their diploma type, because when they're signing the affidavit, they're promising that this information is true. And we'll talk about that in a couple slides. So, and then here's the other place where people get hung up. The student has to maintain a primary residence for a year. A primary residence is where a person predominantly resides physically. They're maintaining that living space and mailing address. It's not the same as a domicile. So in the case of the student that Linda had, they've been living here for 2 years, and it's pretty clear they don't have to switch anything over. They've maintained a living space here. So they do meet that. Well, if they had lived here a year before they started, they would meet it. Time outside of Washington doesn't necessarily interrupt that 1 year period if they've kept their primary residence here. And this is where, again, my answer to you is going to be, a lot of this is professional judgment on you to look at the student's overall situation and to figure out, did they keep that, that 1 year period? A good example of someone who might go out of the state for a year is someone who works every summer at a farm out in another state. And that's pretty common. And that's not an unusual and for them, and they've kept their mailing address here in Washington. That would be a good example of someone who can spend time outside of the state. An example of someone who goes outside of the state and doesn't maintain their primary residence here would be someone who it appears that they picked up and moved to another state and changed their mailing address. And then they decided, oops, I don't want to live there anymore. And they come back. That's not maintaining their primary residence for a year. So it does require a lot of professional judgment on your part. And then this next slide is about what Linda was asking earlier on. What first term do we mean? And we mean the one where residency matters for tuition or financial aid. So examples include a transfer student's first term at your school. It could include a graduate student's first term at the same school they were in undergrad, and other examples like that. So the last box here is what Linda was talking about. If you have a continuing student, so if let's say you all have a student who started last year, they paid non-resident tuition this whole year, but they bring the affidavit to you saying, I lived here for a year and I had a high school diploma before I entered last year, they can now start getting resident tuition and obviously meet financial aid residency requirements. And then affidavit, I want to get into this because then we're gonna transfer over to WASFA information. So there was a question about the affidavit that I'll get to, and basically this affidavit is really where the student is saying to you, these things are true, and the law requires, if they're not already a citizen or a permanent resident, it requires them to say, I promise to apply to be a permanent resident as soon as I am able. Keep in mind that most students signing that don't have a pathway to permanent residency or citizenship. So it's just an interesting statement for them to have to sign off to. But the affidavit is found on the WASFA, and most of your students are going to be, well, I don't know if most, because this is so new that we probably are going to have more students filing it through the paper affidavit. So people who are filing the WASFA get asked the affidavit question, and that's where residency officers and obviously financial aid officers, they're going to use the residency report to see if the student said yes to the affidavit questions. And if the student is not a WASFA filer, they need to use the PDF affidavit that's found on our website, or you might have created one yourself. Students should only fill out one. We don't want to see a situation where the financial aid office tells them, fill it out on the WASFA, and the residency office says, oh, fill out a paper affidavit for me, because the residency office should be getting the information from the residency report that Gabi's going to go over. And this last box is really one of the most crucial pieces. There's no additional documentation required. It's this affidavit, it's a student signing that they're promising that this stuff is true, that these things are true, and that they promise to apply as soon as they're able. So you don't need to be asking for their proof of a high school diploma. Now, if you do see conflicting information in their materials, again, an example of a high school diploma, say, maybe they didn't graduate from high school, then you can work with the student to say, wait, what's true? You've said in the affidavit that you did graduate from high school, but we don't see that you did. That's where you would be potentially working with the student to figure out if they are actually meeting the affidavit requirements. But in general, you're not asking for more info. And also, this is key, you're not following up to see that they applied to be a permanent resident or applied for a green card. So, and so the question about that was from Lori, I think, what does it, what are the risks to the student if they sign an affidavit with false information? What are the risks to the institution? So I would say let's hang on to that question for Justin, because an affidavit is, there's a legal definition behind it, and it's a promise between the student and the institution. Just like when they apply, they're saying, I sign to say that all this stuff is true on my admission application. So I think we should hang on to that question for Justin, because it kind of gets into legal territory. But I would say, you know, however you deal with students who you found may have shared incorrect information on their admissions app, that might be where a similar way of dealing with that. So I'm just writing that note down. Other questions? Sorry, I'm oh, good question. My assumption is that the paper affidavit resides with the school WASAK does not need. That is correct. And you hang on to that paper affidavit based on your school's paper retention policy. So good question. Will this negate certain scholarships such as WUI? That's a good question. I don't know if you would see a WUI student who would live here for a year. Oh, if they have a new matriculation to grad. Oof. Let me think about that one. That's a good question. I mean, they would meet, if they've lived here for a year before going to grad school, they would meet the requirement of this new law. The question then becomes, well, actually, I guess my answer would be they meet the new law. So they would pay in-state tuition if they're going into a graduate program. And good point, Tina. Sometimes it's just people aren't understanding what they're signing. And I think that that's one of the challenges that we have with the affidavit, is wanting to make this as clear as possible while also meeting the law. And that's a difficult thing to do. So Donnie, I hope that the answer about WUI made sense, but yeah, if they've lived here for a year, they meet the requirement, and then they would no longer be WUI, and which makes sense. They'd probably rather pay in-state tuition than WUI tuition. Okay, I want to make sure, because we have guests coming at 11:30, and I want to make sure that we have enough time for Gabi to share about the WASFA and that residency report. So Gabi is going to talk a little bit more about the WASFA, what the residency report looks like. And my only one more takeaway here is that residency officers, even this is another place where you and the financial aid officers really need, if the public institutions really need to communicate, because you need their information to make a residency determination, and then they need your residency determination to make a financial aid determination. So there can be some back and forth here. So I'm going to stop sharing, and then Gabi, I have to give you permission. Okay, Gabi, you should be able to share your screen now. And I'm sorry I didn't give you enough time.
It's all good. Thank you. Okay, I just need 1 second to make sure I've got this set up correctly. So if you need to stretch, please do so. Let's see. Okay, so I'm not going to be able to see the chat with the way my computers are set up. So if you want to just chime in, if you have a question, that would be great, or we could wait until the very end. So today we're going to be going over the WASFA and the residency report. As Gail mentioned, my name is Gabrielle Matul-Wurst. I do go by Gabi. I'm the Assistant Director for Need-Based Programs at the Washington Student Achievement Council. My contact information is here. If you ever have any questions, please do not hesitate to reach out and contact me. Today, we're going to go over basically just what the WASFA is and the WASFA residency report. I know we have kind of a mixed audience here. So some of this is going to be more geared towards the financial aid office for the private institutions, and it'll be a learning experience for your residency officers who haven't been working in financial aid offices. So what is the WASFA? It's the Washington Application for State Financial Aid, and I want to just emphasize the word application. We have a lot of people who refer to the WASFA as a type of aid, which it is not. It's the application for people who cannot do the FAFSA to apply for state financial aid, such as the Washington College Grant, College Bound, Work Study, and so forth. So I have a lot of people that say, you know, I received the WASFA, or do I get the WASFA? So we're kind of trying to change people's verbiage behind the awarding, calling up the actual financial aid. So for that, the WASFA is the application a student completes for financial aid because they don't qualify for federal financial aid. Those students are usually undocumented, or they have a disqualifying immigration status, which Gail went over in her previous session. If you have questions on any of this, Gail is the person to reach out to. She knows all of the unicorns, which I'm not so familiar. I'm one of those people who know more about the basics. But so another person, group of people who can do the WASFA are students or family members that do not or will not file income taxes. We cannot require them to do income taxes if they're doing the WASFA. If the student owes a repayment on a federal grant, or if a student has a defaulted federal loan. So if they haven't been paying their federal loans, then they could do the WASFA because they're not able to do the FAFSA. Okay, a student may choose to complete the WASFA instead of the FAFSA if they are a US citizen. We don't recommend, well, we want to make sure that the students make an educated decision when they choose to do a WASFA instead of doing a FAFSA. A student whose parents are undocumented and they don't feel comfortable providing information on their parents, they may choose to do the WASFA, even though they are US citizens. Eligible students are encouraged to complete the FAFSA to maximize their financial aid awards. Again, if you're doing the WASFA, you're only being considered for state financial aid programs, so you're missing out on the Pell. You won't qualify for any loans and so forth. So we do want to encourage everybody to do a FAFSA when they can. So the colleges are going to use the WASFA to determine residency. So the residency officers can use the residency report and eligibility for state and institutional need-based aid. And as Gail mentioned, the residency affidavit is part of the WASFA. It's actually part of the residency determination in the WASFA application. And for those of you who don't know, the FAFSA runs the WASFA runs parallel to the FAFSA. So it's the majority of the questions mirror the FAFSA. There's a few that we don't have on the WASFA. Like previously before the FAFSA simplification, some of the people who didn't meet the criminal background and the selective service requirement for the FAFSA, some of those students chose to do the WASFA instead, because the WASFA, we did not check those areas. But again, now that the FAFSA simplification is going through, they're going to want to do the FAFSA instead so that they can get all of their awards. So like the FAFSA, the students need to complete it every year. It's available at the beginning on October 1st of each year. And it's open for about 1.5 years. So there's overlapping years open at the time. And this is brand new breaking news. You're the first to hear it pretty much. Is coming up with the 22-23 application. We are adding Spanish language to the questions. So it will have both English and Spanish. It won't be on October 1st when it opens, but it should be by November, will be updated to include Spanish language. So that's really exciting for all of us. And the students will access the WASFA online at the wasak.wa.gov WASFA. The Ready, Set, Grad websites that we used prior are being phased out. So if students go to Ready, Set, Grad, it does give them a box that says, please go to this new website. So this is where we want to direct people. And this is where all the new residency information is as well. We want to remind everybody that WASAK is committed to protecting the confidentiality of the information and privacy of all students and families. So with that said, any of the data collected on the WASFA can only be used for the sole purpose of determining eligibility for state financial aid programs, cannot be used for any other purposes, can't be shared throughout your campus or outside of financial aid. The privacy statement, if you're interested, is located on our WASFA page on WASAK. And we just want to make it clear and remind everybody again that, you know, we do really take it seriously. Quickly, I wanted to give you an overview about how many students are actually completing the WASFA. And it's important to remember that the WASFA completion is not just undocumented students. There's a number of other students who also are completing the WASFA. But for our this year, we're 6 months, we're more than 6 months into the 21-22 application. Like I said, October 1st, the 22-23 application will be opening. But you can see the comparisons over the years for the 6-month counts and the full cycles. And they've been steadily going up since 2017, which is great news. And I expect that they're, with this new residency law, they'll probably keep going up. For the awards, students who did WASFAs, 2,582 of those students were awarded WCG. And the CBS awards have gone down, which we kind of expected because with WCG being an entitlement, more students are getting the full Washington College grant and not needing the CBS as much as they did in the past. But those are still all open to the students. Okay, so we're moving on to the residency report and the residency changes. So the residency changes took effect July 2021. The 21-22 WASFA was open prior to the change in the residency law. So any of the students that you may have at your institution that completed the WASFA prior to July 28th and have not done any updates to their application may still need to be reviewed manually to make sure to see if they're meeting this new residency law. Anybody who submitted applications after July 28th should be good because we do have all of the new residency questions in place. And if they have more than the first transaction, they would have gotten the new questions if they were doing changes to the original application. But we still want you to take a look at the report and see if you are able to offer that to any other students. Okay, and the 22-23 WASFA is going to have all the new residency language updated as well, so you won't need to do manual checks. Okay, so at the public colleges, residency officers determine residency. And I understand this audience is mostly our private institutions for residency are on the line here. And so for those who are in the private financial aid, this is going to be more geared towards you and how you can work with your residency officers. So we ask that the financial aid office work directly with their residencies officers if they find conflicting information, as Gail went over. The financial aid office should share the residency affidavit report with their residency officers. And I'm going to go into that a little bit more in the next screens. And as Gail also said, I just want to emphasize that a student should not be asked to do a paper affidavit if they already did a WASFA. And I understand sometimes they'll do their admissions application prior to the WASFA. So in those instances, might not be avoided, but we want to try to make the students do as little work as possible, repetitive work. Okay, so this residency information, it's available in the WASAK portal with an option to download CSV files. The WASAK portal is only available to financial aid administrators. So that's why we're saying you need to work directly with your financial aid offices to get this report. New and updated applications, they are loaded into the WASAK portal every night. So it takes about 24 hours for a student's WASFA to get uploaded into the system. Understand not all the schools download their applications daily, some do it weekly. So it's best to find out. We usually refer students back to the financial aid office if they have questions about the WASFA. Oftentimes we get calls from students who say that they contacted the school and the school says they don't have their WASFA. So we just want to make sure that everybody does look into the WASAK portal if a student is asking about it, if you're not downloading them on a regular basis. Okay, and you're only going to be able to see the WASFA if that student put your school on their application, same as you would with the FAFSA. Okay, I'm going to skip ahead on that. This is the WASAK portal where financial aid staff can look up the WASFA applications. So you go into the WASFA applications, you can select academic year, sort it out by academic year. You're only going to see the school that you're assigned to. And then you can ask for just the brand new transactions, or if you don't click that box, you get all of the transactions. And we ask for you to do the residency data only. And this is going to pull up the information that you can share with your residency officers for the reporting. Okay, so there's a few different ways of being able to search it. We recommend that you do, if you're going to search individual students, do it by their name and an ID number. If you can, do it a few ways if you don't find it the first time. So once you're in here and you download the report, the information is going to show right below, and it's just going to give the basic residency information. There's not going to be any financial information. So you can review it here inside the WASFA interface and the WASAK interface. Or when you download it, you're going to get an Excel file that you can share. This is the file that we're saying that you can share along with your residency officers. There's going to be much more data on there than what I'm showing here on the screen. It includes their names, their dates of birth, social securities, ITINs, all those informations. But what I've done is I've just cleared those out for this example. But the screens that you're really going to want to look at are the ones that are highlighted in yellow below. The legal residency for 5 years. That's one of the questions on the WASFA. To let you know, we are asking them to update it, and I believe it will be updated on the next WASFA in October. That question is not going to ask if they've been a legal resident or a resident for the state that they're claiming for 5 years. We're changing that to 1 year so that it aligns with the new residency law. So then you could look at that. If they say they have not been here for a year, the next one is going to be the legal residency date. So if they say they've been here for a year prior to their first term of enrollment, you'll see that they should meet the residency. And then it goes on to have the other eligibility requirements listed out as well for the financial aid folks to determine if they have the high school diploma and if they've completed the Washington residency affidavit. The column with the Washington residency affidavit, that is going to normally say yes, and a 1 means yes. If it says no there, that would be because they are then asked if they are DACA student. So if they say yes to DACA student, they've met the residency. And if they say no to DACA, then that means that they aren't able to confirm the affidavit. They're not able to confirm DACA. And so you would have to determine whether they could qualify for institutional aid or if they could meet residency with one of the other 25 ways that are listed for residency. So basically, that's as simple as the report is. So what we are asking again is that the financial aid office and the residency officers, if you could reach out to your financial aid office and let them know you're interested in getting this report, they should be able to download it and get it to you securely. And we do want to make sure that this information is kept confidential and protected as much as possible. And that's basically what I have today, real quick and dirty overview. Are there any questions regarding what we just went over?
Thank you, Gabi. So there were some questions in the chat that we were answering. One was basically whether we can use the WASFA, the residency report, whether the residency officers can use the residency report as their affidavit form. And I said yes, and that we would actually follow up with the document that you made. We have a document that Gabi made we can share out with you all that goes in more detail about how to read that report. And then another thing just that I put in there was that we anticipate that most WASFA filers are actually going to be saying yes to the affidavit questions. So you're not going to see too many people who are going to say no to that. And if they, thank you, Gabi.
Yes, I got that there for you all.
Yes. So those outline how to read that report. There's a question about for FAFSA filers, when do we need to ask them to sign the affidavit?
I will leave that for Gail.
So that, again, like a lot of my answers are, that's up to you. That's an institutional choice. I mean, it's basically on when you're determining a student's residency. So it would be when you have a student, like, I don't know the private institutions, so this is PLU, how they decide when a student is a resident or not, but it would be however you determine a student's residency, whatever point in your process that is, that's when you could share out the affidavit as an option. And then there's some questions about CTC link that I'm just going to let Tanjige to continue to answer. So yeah, any other questions about WASFA and the affidavit in the WASFA?
Not so much a question, but one issue that we're having with the WASFA residency report is because it includes everybody who listed UW, whether they're a student or not, the volume is a bit daunting. And just to share that for us, we're having to figure out a way to take the information from that report and then run it against our student information system to see who actually is enrolled. And so that we aren't just checking, everybody on there and going through.
Right, that's an
It's
excellent
taking us
point.
a little longer to get up to speed with that.
Okay, great. Thank you for sharing that. Actually, I didn't really ever think about that from our side. So I'm going to do some brain thinking and see if there's any way that we can maybe possibly help out with that.
That would be fabulous. 'Cause, yeah, we'd love to be able to use it. It's just a little difficult for us.
Yeah, I'm going to write that down and see what, all our brains in the office can think of if we can help you out on that. That would be awesome. Thank you.
Thanks for catching that. And any of these types of things like this, just let Gabi or I know. I know most of you know me, and I work with Gabi really closely. So anything that comes up like that, we can try to work on that. And I
Can I ask oh, I'm sorry.
Oh no, I was just gonna say in the chat, I see a possible request for an optional field on the WASFA for the student to enter their student ID number. Yeah.
Okay.
This is Teresa from Skagit, and we are seeing the same thing, that students aren't enrolled, but I'm assuming that we are getting them on our report because they put Skagit as their college of choice. And if that's the case and we don't identify them and code them in the first place, then we could miss them if they register later after we have already gone through that report. And so we've been going ahead and recoding them if they meet the requirements, so that when they do decide to enroll, then we have already done the work and we don't miss them. And I'm just wondering, there's nothing that we will get back later that says, oh, go back through and recode this student because now they've registered at your college.
So you're saying that like they don't show up on a new report, for example?
Well, once we download them and they're not enrolled, we've already downloaded their WAFSA. They're not going to show up again if they register later. And if you skip over them, you've missed them.
Gabi, yeah.
Yeah, I just want to mention that the WASFA is continually changing. People can complete the WASFA at any time. So if you have a certain cutoff date, you're going to be missing students. So I would probably recommend that, after you do your initial, perhaps maybe once a month or, more frequently, that you could do the report, and then you could just download newer transactions.
Right,
not-
but once they've done the WAFSA and we've already downloaded it, if we skip them and don't code them as a resident, we're not going to get another one because they're not going to do another WAFSA. And if they register later after we've already downloaded that WAFSA information, then we're going to miss them.
Right. So there is some point of student self-advocacy that needs to happen with that. I'm not sure how else you would catch them. Does anybody else at another college have a suggestion?
We just actually just go ahead and code them and get them determined. And then when they do register, then they're already determined and there's no roadblocks for them.
I mean, that seems like a good option. Maybe Gabi, one of the things I'm taking away from some of the questions that we're getting is that I think that there could be another maybe session in the future where we get more in depth on the technicalities of this. And so stay tuned for something like that. And it looks like Danette has an idea for communicating to WASFA filers to email you to let them know when they're enrolling so you can update their record. So let's go ahead, and that's actually a good segue into hearing from some folks that we have asked to join us today, who are actually all recent graduates and work with different nonprofits in the area that support undocumented students. And I've asked them to join us today to share their experience with residency. And we're interested in the residency process in general, but we're going to be focused specifically on the undocumented students experience. And the reason why is because undocumented students who've never had DACA have until this new law have had probably the most barriers to accessing residency law. And so if we start to think about the barriers and start to take away the barriers for undocumented students, then that takes away barriers for all students. And so that's why we're focusing on that, not to mention the fact that this new law is a big deal, and we want to examine it from all angles. So I'd like to invite Elizabeth and Zawadi and Daniela, and if the three of you would be willing to turn on your video if you're okay with that, and unmute and go ahead and just introduce yourself. Let's start with Elizabeth.
Hi, I'm Lisbeth, or Liz. I use she, they pronouns, and I have worked with the Communities for Our Colleges Coalition to pass Senate Bill 5194, and I'm now working with the Washington Fuzz. I'll pass it to Zawadi.
Thank you, Liz. Hi, everyone. I'm Zawadi Shege. I use she, her pronouns. I recently graduated from Tacoma Community College during the pandemic in 2020. And I'm now working with Communities for Our Colleges Coalition doing enrollment outreach. And I'll pass it to Daniela.
Hi, everybody. Nice to see you, Zawadi and Lisbeth. So my name is Daniela, pronouns are she, they, and I also graduated from UW in 2019. So it's been 2 years now, and I work in education, both in grassroots organizing with the Washington Joint Coalition and education efforts in the region, as well in direct service support to students. So I get to work with a good amount of undocumented students, but also just every student who may need it, specifically in the South region.
Well, thank you. Sorry, and I just want to thank you again for joining us. On the call, you have folks who make residency decisions at our public and private schools. And so I think some of you were on the call and got to see what kind of complicated situations get to come up. And so we want to help demystify what it's what it can be like on the student side of things. So I just had a few questions, and this part of the session was supposed to go till 12. If people want to stay a little bit longer, we can do that. And so I don't know about the three of you. Are you able to stay for like another 10, 15 minutes? Okay, that sounds great. And then obviously our attendees, if you're able to stay, please do, but I understand we said this was 10 to 12. So here's my first question, and that is how/when did you first learn about the student residency requirement for in-state tuition and state financial aid?
The silence of choosing an order, trying to communicate through a screen. I first learned about the in-state, being able to apply for in-state tuition once I had already enrolled at Wenatchee Valley College. I think I was close to ending my first quarter when the diversity, equity, and inclusion director let me know hey, are you paying in-state tuition? And I was like, no. And she guided me through that process. I'll pass it on.
Yeah, the first time I heard about it was in June 24th, I believe, is when I first heard about it, which was a really dope change to see, because I work with NWEA, so with Northwest Education Access, we support students with direct service. So I remember seeing it, and first thing I did was share about it to my colleagues that we all work with students across the region, and so that was a change that I knew was going to benefit a lot of our students, and that's the first time I heard about it. I hope I got your answer right. I mean, your question right.
No, that's great. I have an additional question for you. Since you work with a lot of students, how do they typically hear about the fact that residency is a requirement to get in-state tuition and get financial aid? Is it from you? Is it from their family? Is it from their friends? Is it from their schools?
Yeah, so since I work with students directly, we go through the entire, and it's very one-on-one. And as soon as I get a student referral, I work with that student from, as long as they allow me, right? It's very student-centered and student-paced. So we start those conversations from early on. We talk about financial aid. We talk about, of course, not asking, are you undocumented? Because you should never ask students, is they're undocumented, but having those conversations around, there's requirements, there's eligibility, there's a lot of applications and pieces that need to come together. And I like to just kind of tell them myself, I'm undocumented. So if they happen to be, they typically tell me. And so from there, I'm able to start, filling out the required paperwork and such. And I've got a lot of students who have just moved to Washington State from other states here in the United States, and students as well that are immigrating from other countries. And so that's been a conversation. I had one student who, she graduated with a high school diploma in Honduras, but she was not able to, that didn't count as a Washington State diploma. So she had to go to a completion program at Renton Technical College to have the equivalent piece. So now that that's changed, I'm really excited that students will not have to go through that additional step, right, of having to get a Washington State diploma in order to qualify for residence or to, qualify for in-state tuition. So that's a little bit of the experience I've had, and it's going to be super beneficial for future students.
Thank you. So Adi, do you have any experiences for either yourself or others about how you first heard or how friends first heard about residency requirements?
Yeah, I first heard about it through actually my older brother. And I'm very privileged to have someone who's older than me who has been through the processes. And so I remember talking about college in the future and kind of freaking out because I didn't know what to do. And that's when he was explaining it to me. And yeah, so I feel very privileged to have him as like a guiding force when I was in high school. And I'm also very excited about the change because it will create more pathways to people and provide a lot of opportunities that people didn't have before. So yeah.
So Zawadi, can you share, do you remember when, so your brother helps you and then you start applying to college, and I don't know if you applied for financial aid, but was the process, were you admitted as a resident student, or did you have to apply for it, and how was that process like for you?
Oh geez, yeah. So I graduated from high school in 2018. And I also I don't have DACA, but I was applying for DACA in around 2016. And then Trump cut the DACA initial applications. And I was like, oh no, this is awful. I don't know. And that's why I was like freaking out to my brother, because I was like, I don't know what I'm gonna do. And I remember it being very confusing. He wasn't living with me at the time. So it was still hard and I was very confused. The paperwork was also very confusing for me, and I didn't know who else to turn to. But I didn't have to, I was privileged in the way that I didn't have to apply for residency. So that was one less barrier, but I remember looking at the paperwork in front of me on like the screen and being like, I don't know what any of this means, and I don't know who to go to. And so, yeah, so that was my experience. It became easier when I was like involved with grassroots organizations and people who have been through the process, who could help me in person. But I remember it being very daunting and difficult and very confusing.
Thank you. Similarly, Lisbeth, you have an interesting story because you didn't get residency that first term. So when you found out from the staff person that shared that with you, what was your next step? How did you get residency? What was that process like?
Yeah, what I had to do is I remember her name is Maritrui, and she helped me a lot with all of it. She had me go to the main office at the college at Wenatchee Valley College, and then I filled out the paper, and then I waited a long time, and I was like, I haven't heard anything back, and so then I had to keep going back, and I think through that process learned more of being a self-advocate and trying to figure things out. There's this phrase that she kept telling me, which is kind of sad because we shouldn't have to be going back and forth as much as we did, at least as much as I did. But it was in Spanish, el pájaro que pía, agarra la lombriz, which is the bird that trips the most is the one that gets the worm. And so I really did feel like a bird, just not constantly going back and back and back until they finally updated me and told me, yeah, you're going to qualify for, I think I didn't get it for winter quarter. I got it for spring quarter.
And Daniela, I see you nodding your head a little bit. Is that bird concept resonating with you and the students that you work with?
Absolutely. Yeah, I have a student who has been in an intricate situation of proving residency, although we had signed the HB 1079 when he was back, that's what the law was. So that was just thinking about that experience being very real to students and to myself as well. As I was also recalling my experience when I first was going to college at a community college. And I didn't know about the in-state residency until my older sister told me about it. So I was resonating as well with Zawadi's situation of me having that privilege of having an older sibling who had been navigating, the higher ed system. So I remember she told me, you have to go to the admissions office and you have to tell them you're an HB 1079 student. And that was the first time that I was introduced to that, and identifying with the law was weird. I was like, okay, I'm an HB 1079 student. So that's when I went, because she told me, right, they won't tell you this, right? You need to kind of advocate for yourself, which I agree with Lisbeth. It's not something that students should have to do, because they didn't tell me at first and they wanted to charge out of state. And so when I went and did that, they're like, oh yeah, here's the affidavit, sign that and give it back to me. And so I was like, is that easy? And the paper was right next to him. So I remember just feeling a lot of frustration at that time. And I had a friend as well who was like, I'm paying out of state. And I asked why, like around that same time. And I told her the same. I was like, okay, you go and tell them that you're an HB 1079 student and you'll sign a form and you'll pay in state. Because it was something that was not communicated to students when in my experience. So I was just thinking about all of that experience I had.
So that makes me think, so what I'm hearing that is a shared thread among your stories is that you heard about it through someone who either was a family member or a friend. Randy's doing the dance. Or you heard about it from an employee who doesn't make residency decisions or admission decisions or financial aid decisions. So you basically heard it from a caring person who was there to help you. So I guess my question would be, like, what advice would you give? Well, I guess my first question would be, like, if you had, I didn't give you guys this question ahead of time, so this is a new one. But if you were sitting down with the president of every school who's on this call, and you said, you know, from my point of view regarding residency, here's a piece of advice I would like to share with you. What would that advice be? And I can let you think on it for a little bit because I didn't give you that question ahead of time.
Something that's coming to mind for me is making sure, I think it's something that we're working on through the Communities for Our Colleges Coalition as well. But similarly to like an enrollment campaign that we've had right now is for presidents or like colleges to direct resources towards the enrollment and like admissions process so that students can be aware of like what it entails and the complexities that it has, because I think high schools try their best, but like they are very much high schools and don't always like know the best or up-to-date information versus like a college putting in that effort to make sure that students can access and like enroll and not have to go through all these difficult circumstances of like, I don't know if I qualify for this or not, or I didn't even know that existed. It's something that like with incentive and with like funding can help a lot of students.
So in that case, like, especially if you're talking about students going directly from high school to college, the high schoolers, they know their counselors say. And if they ask their counselor about something, but the counselor doesn't have the most up-to-date information, they might get guided the wrong way. Is that kind of what you're?
Yeah, in my experience, at least, like my high school counselor, the college transferring system that they had in place was not like productive at all. In that they really just centered on like helping and supporting citizens. And so when it came to like undocumented students or students who like were residents rather than citizens, it was just like, oh, there's WASFA, and that was like it. And even then, like not everyone told you that there was WASFA because yeah, it was weird.
Which, you know, you're making me think, one of my other questions to you too, you can think about is, you all kind of said at some point, I heard about it from a friend or whoever, but then I still didn't really know what to do. So Zawadi or Daniela, do you have your advice to the college presidents?
I definitely second that. In my head, I was thinking about accessibility, and that goes hand in hand to what Liz was saying, because I remember my experience in high school was very much of me like explaining these kinds of things to people who were supposed to be helping me, and receiving limited to like zero help. And it made it a very isolating experience as an undocumented student, because it just meant that I had limited places to go to, even though like a counselor is supposed to be there to help you, but then there's a counselor who doesn't know about these things, and then you're having to explain your situation, and it's just a weird dynamic. So I definitely agree with Liz. I think that would also be my advice, to direct them to people who have the resources, and to resources, because yeah, that's the thing that helped me the most. And it also provided a safe space for me, going to organizations and speaking to people like Daniela, who work with students and who have been through the space as someone who is undocumented as well. So that would also be my advice.
Yeah, no, I totally align with what folks have shared in terms of the advice. Something that I have been very hopeful to see is to see just further professional development within the financial aid offices, just because each campus is so different, so there can be a disconnect. Because I was a transfer student, so I have that transfer experience from a community college to Bethel, and that was a lot. Like, I knew that I had to learn, right, how to advocate for myself, because I learned the language and I learned what to say to the financial aid office. And I remember when I went to Bethel, they were telling me I didn't qualify to get WASFA, even though I told them I've been getting WASFA community college for 2 years. What do you mean? And so that was very frustrating to have to kind of like folks have said, informing and educating and teaching the financial aid office about why I do qualify and I should be receiving WASFA. And if I were any other student, right, they would have just walked out without like being misinformed and not being supported in the ways that they should have in that situation. So that I remember just feeling a lot of frustration then. So yeah, definitely professional development across all like financial aid offices across campus, and just maintaining like less amount of bureaucratic documentation and process, because that is very inaccessible as well. And also, yeah, like accessibility to students directly, more direct communication, and building stronger relationships with students, and or maybe like organizations that work with students in the area as well, to build a stronger relationship to students, because that's really the biggest thing too that I think about. Because when I talk to the offices for the students feel, like, I don't know, it's very tense, the relationship there. So that's just what comes up to mind. Sorry, I'm not being super articulate, but that's just what comes up to mind for me.
What I'm hearing, and please respond or nod, but what I'm hearing is that like, or what I'm assuming, I'm going to make an assumption that after a while, if you're going to different offices and having to explain yourself every time, or having to explain your situation, or give, like Zawadi, like a mini immigration lesson or something like that, would you say that sometimes you just don't have the energy to find out if that new office understands your situation or not? Because sometimes they may, right? Sometimes it's like, oh great, this person understands me, but sometimes it's, you never know when you knock on that door or get on that Zoom call. Is that a correct? Does that happen, I guess, is my question. Or does that lead to any other thoughts? So why do you go ahead?
Okay. Yeah, for sure. I remember being like so emotionally exhausted throughout high school, and even in my community college days as well. It was exhausting to do, and it felt very like I said before, it felt very isolating, and it's not like a feeling that you want to give to your students who are seeking help. So there was a point where I was like, you know what, I'm just not going to bring this up anymore, and I'm going to just have to figure out a different way. And luckily I had people, and my brother had people that he knew that could also help me, but not everyone has that. And I'm very aware of that. And there are different struggles that students are already going through with family life, and also looking at like class and race dynamics and the complexities within that. So yeah, not everyone has that, and it is very frustrating and exhausting to where you just don't want to do that again and again and again.
Daniela, I saw that you had, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree with that. For that situation I had at, the financial aid office, I remember walking out and just feeling just the direct marginalization. That's the way I kept thinking about it. Like, I called my sister and I was like, I feel like the marginalization right now feels very strong, like physically in real time, and that's fucking frustrating. Sorry for cussing, but that can get very frustrating and definitely drained my energy to have to be battling my situation where it's like I just want to go to school. Like, that's all I'm trying to do here. So that was, yeah, definitely agree with Sawadi there.
Liz, do you have any thoughts about that concept?
Yeah, it's definitely really frustrating. And I remember like multiple times, like while I was waiting for like the residency stuff to settle or whatever they were doing, just like crying because I was like, I don't know what I'm gonna do. Like, I can't actually afford this, even though I had tried to. I do remember that after, even though it started, I got in-state tuition my spring quarter, I like had to take off like summer and also, which is normal, but like fall and winter quarter the next year because I was like, I need to save up money because I can't afford this. And then I think right now as well, I was hoping to transfer to like a university after Wenatchee Valley College, but like in the process of like trying to transfer and applications and all that stuff, it's just been so hectic that I'm like, I need a time away from this. And so I won't be transferring this year, but yeah, it's been an interesting time.
So it's almost like, I thought Daniela said it best, like, I just want to be a student, but there's all these, to be a student, there's all this other stuff I have to do. And I don't have the energy for it right now. Maybe I will in a few months, but right now I don't. Yeah.
Yeah. And I say that like knowing that like I helped pass SB 5194 and like I know this stuff, but I'm just like, I know there's other students, and like the privilege that I have of now being in the know is something that other students don't have. And so yeah, there's a lot of work to do on that side, that aspect of it.
Thank you. And actually, thanks for bringing up the fact, I know that our communities for our colleges, so Liz and Zawadi, I don't know, Daniela, if you were part of it, were the two of you part of helping pass that new law? The new residency law?
I just began working with them about 5 weeks ago. But Liz, I'll pass it to Liz.
Yeah. I started volunteering with the coalition around last year when we first started meeting, early days of the pandemic. So yeah.
Great. So yeah, just for those of you who don't know, that the organization that they're volunteering with was behind this law. This law is actually way bigger than the residency piece. It's a lot of equity work in the community colleges that some of you from our community technical colleges may know about, but I'm just focused on the residency piece when I'm going over training. So I just have one more question, because probably people are heading out to lunch. I would say, let's see. What's one thing you'd like attendees to remember from what you shared from this panel? Daniela, do you want to start?
Yeah, I mean, from the conversation we've had today, like there's clearly frustration that students have with, with the financial aid office. So just, I understand, financial aid offices are doing a whole lot, and that's appreciated. But yeah, like students, specifically undocumented students, have to deal with a lot more, I feel like, because every campus is just so different in terms of how they decide. So just making it as open and accessible to students is really hopeful, like the best thing that can be done, is what I'm thinking of right now.
Liz?
I think something is that like the when it comes to at least like in state, like the residency requirement, that like it has a very real effect on students, and it's more than just like, oh, more paperwork, or like the admin side of it. Like for students who are waiting to qualify or to like receive the notice of like you got in-state tuition, you are qualified as a resident, can really change like the word just escaped my mind, but like the experience that they have at their college. And it's like a rather large piece. I think that sets the tone for the rest of it.
And Zawadi?
Yeah, I think I also was thinking about just trying to trying to cultivate a safe space. And like Daniela had said, being open and making sure that students have access, and if like their situation, you don't know about it, that's okay, but just sending them towards people who can help and also are cultivating safe spaces for them is very important. And I think the emotional side of doing this as an undocumented student can weigh a lot on someone, and be discouraging to even go to college because of this. So yeah, I would also say to be like open and as accessible as possible.
Well, oh, Danielle, did you have something to add?
Yeah, just one thing that came up to mind that I remembered is, I do some educator trainings on how to best support undocumented students. And something that we encourage educators is, being an ally to undocumented students can show up as you outing yourself to students, instead of students always having to do that labor of needing to explain their situation. So educators, how can you come out to them as, can support you. I know those steps, I know the process. It's as simple as some imagery around, like, I'm an educator that supports undocumented students. I know that we would say, put, a poster in your office, but thinking about remote work, what that could look like is putting it on your signature, or just being creative, right? So student can, because if I were to see that as a student back then, like some type of imagery on the wall in the office, I would feel like a lot more, supported, and that I can talk a little bit more openly. Like Zawadi said, being open and being like of a resource and support to students, that would make me feel more comfortable.
Thank you for that. I think that's a great image to land on. I really like that. I think there's when I was working at Evergreen, I had a LGBTQ safe space sticker on my door. I had actually a veterans, I don't know what we called it, Randy, if it was a veterans safe space sticker. I didn't have an undocumented one though, so that would have been nice to have. And just one more thing to go off of that concept is one thing that I share with folks when I can is, if you are doing, for those of us who are the practitioners in the room, if you are doing sessions about anything, doesn't have to just be residency, but obviously in this case, if you're doing a residency session or a financial aid session, making the assumption that one person in the room might be undocumented, or one person in the room might be whatever it is you're talking about, they might be the person who is the furthest from that resource, because someone might be, and even if they're not, they know people who are. And so you want to always make sure that all the possibilities might be at least addressed, or at least made clear, like, hey, we can help with, we know the process for undocumented students too, or whatever it is that they need to say to make that clear. So, and I want to thank our guests. There were a lot of people were thanking you in the chat. I don't know if you saw it, but I think one of the things that makes me excited is from some of our attendees, they said, this experience is going to help me rethink some of our communications. So you might see some of your suggestions play out at some of the colleges that are here today. So we really thank you for your time. And I thank everybody for being willing to hang on for another 15 minutes. But what we'll go ahead and do is I'll go ahead and leave, or I'll stop this session of the Zoom. And then for those of you who are able to come back at 2, you can just log into the same link that you logged in today, or you can stay logged in and look at everybody's blank screen if you want. But I'm going to go ahead and end it, and we'll see you all at 2. Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.